So, send in the tanks? Russia's cruise missile strike against an apartment building far from any strategic target in Dnipro sends calling cards to both Ukraine and its NATO allies. We'll ask about the consequences of the Dnipro attack, both domestically and among member states of the Atlantic Alliance. Ever since Vladimir Putin's surprise invasion of his neighbor last year, NATO has upped its support for Kyiv in increments. And after France and the US's pledge of light armored vehicles, what does Britain's weekend decision to send proper tanks change? There's the logistics of it and the politics of it. The UK's decision increases pressure on a reluctant Germany to forego its post-war doctrine of avoiding battlefield confrontations. We'll ask about the resignation of Olaf Scholz, defense minister, who hails from his own Social Democratic Party. Many Germans worry about mission creep. Is it already too late to turn back? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at NATO, Russia, and the war in Ukraine. With us, former French ambassador to Germany, Bernard de Montferrand. Welcome back to the show.
Good afternoon.
Commentator Jakob Hessler is in our studios as well. How are you, sir?
Very well. How are you?
I'm okay. From Berlin, Ulrika Franke, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations think tank. Thanks so much for joining us.
Wonderful. Good evening.
And from Oxford, former UK military intelligence officer Frank Ledwidge, Senior Lecturer in Strategy at Portsmouth University. How are you?
Good evening to you all.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. A war crime. That's how Sweden, which holds the rotating presidency of the European Council, brands Saturday's strike on Dnipro. Moscow claims success in hitting, quote, a military command and control system and energy facilities. It makes no mention of the more than 40 killed so far in an apartment building that was home to 1,700 residents.
The explosion was very long. It seemed so long. My child and I were screaming so hard that my throat hurt. I don't know what the point was. There isn't a single military facility here. This is a residential area.
Frank Ledwidge, that woman in Dnipro doesn't know what the point was. Do you?
No, war crime, plain and simple. The very best you can say, I suppose, which has been said about other civilian targets hit, I suppose it's only an excuse, I don't think it washes here, is that the apartment block got in the way, as it were, of a cruise missile that was targeted at something else. The Russians have shown themselves to be sometimes rather, let's put it kindly, cack-handed at their targeting, and occasionally fail to notice that apartment blocks have been built on trajectories of missiles. But I think in this case it was deliberate, and therefore, as Sweden and any other objective observer might put it, a war crime, pure and simple.
A Soviet-era cruise missile, one used to target ships, I believe. So is this a sign that they're running low on the ammo they need and the weaponry they need to hit strategic targets?
Sometimes they repurpose missiles, notably the S-300 anti-aircraft missile, and they've been doing that for decades. It doesn't necessarily mean they're running short. What's interesting this weekend is that this salvo of missiles that knocked out or damaged some electrical infrastructure was comprised, according to the Ukrainians, of about 30 missiles. In previous salvos, and they come in pulses every 2 weeks or so, have been of 70 or more. So it looks as if certainly the scale is reducing, which would tend to indicate that Western intelligence services are right in noting that their so-called precision missiles stock is depleting. We don't really know, but certainly if you're firing anti-ship missiles at apartment blocks, it does seem a misdirection of that particular weapon system, let's put it that way.
If you want to look at the timing, and we will, Saturday's strike comes in the wake of Russia's first battlefield victory in months. Proxy militias of the People's Donetsk Republic publishing footage of Soledar on their Telegram channel. The taking of that salt mining town late last week is important. It's a gateway to nearby Bakhmut. It's a first win in a long time, and it raises questions. Is Russia going on the offensive? Or was the taking of Soledar just kind of a one-off, Jakob Hessler?
Well, I think there are two interpretations. One is that it was a Pyrrhic victory. In fact, such a small target, which was obtained at an incredibly high human cost for the Wagner troops.
But it is a gateway to Bakhmut, and Bakhmut's a gateway to bigger towns.
That's the other interpretation, which is to say, yes, the salt mines, and they can store all this weaponry in there. But there is when you think about the counteroffensive in the fall that was successful, it was actually following similar attrition-type battles where the Russians lost a lot of people. Now, and the difference is obviously that this time they have a lot more people in the back that they can throw at it again with the new recruits. But I wouldn't pretend to have the answer. I think both explanations is what I see.
Bernard de Montferrand, is it some kind of turning point, or just a one-off what we saw in Solidar?
I think it's a process which is being followed by the Russians, which is a dirty war, not against an army, but against the people, against civil equipments, infrastructures. This has to reinforce our determination to support Ukraine, to support it militarily by sending equipment, sending munitions, but also in the civilian domain to help the Ukraine to rebuild or to face this the threat. Whether it's a sign of weakness on the side of the Russians to attack civilian infrastructures, or a sort of very long-term process to say we know it doesn't matter what is the cause, what is the secondary effects. We have time before us, and we are ready to destroy this country. If this is the case, I think our resolve should be even stronger today. The resolve of NATO, I think, of NATO members is very strong. But as you know, delivering armaments is not a decision of NATO as such, but as all the individual countries. And I think there is a great consciousness of the needs of Ukraine.
Ulrike Franke, this is an essential point that you just heard from Bernard de Montferrand. The wondering whether there's this calculus on the part of Moscow that time is on its side and that it's digging. In fact, we've seen reports the last couple of days of more trenches being dug along the whole of a front that's very long from the Black Sea all the way up to Belarus. If that's the case, what is the West's reaction?
So I think what you are describing is exactly the reason why Ukraine wants to go on the counteroffensive as soon as possible. Because Ukraine, of course, the Ukrainians want to reconquer the territory that is still occupied by Russia. And the longer they wait with this counteroffensive, because they don't have the tools, the more dug in the Russians will be. And importantly, the more atrocity they can commit on this territory. And this is exactly why the Ukrainians are asking for certain weapon systems at the moment, combat tank, most importantly, so heavy tanks, heavy combat tanks, most importantly, so they can go on the counter-offensive and try to reconquer this territory before Russia has really occupied it in a way that would make it extremely difficult to reconquer.
Yeah, and a long war is exactly, as was said, that what the West wants to avoid. The next step, as you say, Ulrike, is tanks. Britain's Challenger 2s, the first pledged, a squadron of Challenger 2s. And if you're keeping score, that means 14 of those large armored vehicles confirmed to the House of Commons this Monday by the Defense Secretary. Frank Ludwig, what do 14 tanks change?
On the battlefield, they won't change too much. They amount to what the Americans would call a company, what the Brits would call a squadron. These tanks, however, are probably just about a generation ahead of most of the armoured vehicles, the tanks, the main battle tanks that the Russians have. Although they are getting a little bit obsolete for NATO now.
Because I was going to ask you what purpose they serve. It's been an artillery war. People, they fire. when they get the coordinates, and then they move the armament as quick as they can because there's going to be an incoming fire to counter. What do more tanks change?
Okay, operationally then, Ulrich is quite right. The main battle tank will allow, along with, by the way, the Marders, the AMX-10s that the French will be sending, and the Bradleys that the Americans are beginning to go. They're armoured personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles. So they need to go along with the tanks in order to ensure that they don't make the mistake the Russians made in the past of allowing infantry with missile systems to kill the tanks. So in other words, tanks form part of a system of mechanized warfare, and they will be used to attack those Russian lines. And you need tanks to be able to do that because they're so heavily armored. But they, in turn, as I indicated, need these other vehicles alongside them. The numbers so far indicated are insignificant. So the British gift is essentially to set an example and to encourage, I think, specifically Germany to start moving on those export licenses. When they do, the tanks that will suit Ukraine will be the Leopard 2s. And once we start getting significant numbers of those, we may see them making an impact on the battlefield.
And we had coincidence of the calendar, the Polish prime minister in Berlin this Monday saying, give us the tanks.
Well, it's Poland. I think Finland is ready. Poland is ready. And I think so. Frank, subject to your confirmation, my information is that roughly they need at least about 100 of tanks at minimum. So there are 2,000, I counted this, 2,300 Leopard 2 tanks spread over 13 NATO countries, even though quite a few of them are probably not in exactly full operational readiness, but you should be able to find 100 if you want to.
Because we wake up every morning, Bernard de Montferrand, with reports that this war has exposed just how much the arsenal of NATO members is obsolete and out of date. Is it true, though?
Of course it is true, because we have lived with what we call the dividends of peace. And for the last 20 years, we thought that no fighting of high intensity would take place in Europe. So the decline in defense expenditures has been very, very, very strong. I think there has been a reversal, but it's slow and it takes time. And it takes time for two reasons. The first one is the industrial production. The second, and of course, the availability of the budget availability. The second aspect is that you have to have equipment which are ready to fight. And you have to have people who are ready to fight. And this is much more difficult and much more important. So it takes time. We should reach 2% of GDP in defense expenditures all over NATO quickly. But I think we should need much more. If you look at the reports for each different countries, for instance, in France, it is clear that to reach our goals in matters of defense, we should allocate.
And will public opinion follow? We're 3%. In a country.
We should need 3%.
We need 3%, but will public opinion follow? We're in a week where later on there's going to be big strikes against pension reform. Do the French want spending on defense?
Are our political leaders ready to talk clearly to the public opinion? Nobody has ever been talking very clearly to the public opinion. I think when the public opinions in Europe look at TV, your different emissions, they begin to understand. But their leaders have not really been talking about that clearly.
But I think what's behind it is also there's a reversal of doctrine. It used to be that we thought because we have mutually assured destruction with nuclear weapon, nobody would be so foolish as to start a conventional war. Now we almost get the opposite, which is because you have nuclear weapon, you can actually go start and invade your neighboring country, because if ever someone hammers back too hard, you can always swing the stick of the nuclear weapon. And that new doctrine is sort of a de facto doctrine, but it means that suddenly tanks, that was what decided First World War and Second World War, like tanks becoming the centerpiece of European defense architecture when we thought it was enough that we could have a counter-strike capability to just annihilate the other side if they pushed on the wrong button. Well, that is a real change in mindset. And in a way, the people in Ukraine are fighting today a war on behalf of, in a way, the rest of Europe. Go to the Baltic states and ask about their opinion. Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, they'll tell you that, in fact, if it weren't the Ukrainians, they feel it'd be them.
Ulrike Franke, I know that German public opinion is very divided.
Yes, to some extent. Let me quickly make a point about the Leopard tanks, so not to create a kind of wrong impression among the viewers. So it is correct that there are around 2,000 Leopard tanks all over Europe. So this is a German-made tank, has been produced since the 1980s, and there are different variants. And there are different variants. This is the really important thing, because it's not as if there are 2,000 tanks in Europe and all of these are kind of inter-exchangeable. Basically, there are several variants. So the 2A4 is the one that we're probably talking about delivering to Ukraine. There's the 2A5, 2A6, 2A7. Now, the reason we're not talking about these newer systems is because some of them are kind of so new and developed that there would be concerns about them falling into Russian hands. That's the one thing. And the other thing is that these are systems of which most countries only have, a few systems and are unwilling, or they would say unable to deliver it. The 2A4 is the one where there are most tanks around, and most importantly, Germany has some of them in stock, or the industry has some of them in stock, although they aren't immediately available.
Yeah,
so just that viewers don't get the impression that there are 2,000 systems and it should be easy to send 100. I mean, I think it should be possible to send 100, but it's not quite as easy as that. Importantly, because it is a German-made system, countries that want to re-export or send these tanks to Ukraine will need to ask Germany for a re-exporting license, which is decided, basically by the cabinet and led by the chancellor. So it's very much Olaf Scholz's decision. And although
and just for Germany, that's a watershed moment, making that decision.
Absolutely. So I have heard these news that Poland and Finland are supposedly ready to send the tanks, but importantly, they haven't asked officially Germany yet to grant the re-exporting license. Maybe because they imagine they wouldn't be getting it right now. I don't know, but just because I think this is important. But yes, absolutely. So Germany, or the German government, is very reticent when it comes to sending this. Now, you may have, if you followed the kind of German debate over the last few months, there have been several steps like this. There was always this saying, we can only deliver defensive but not offensive weapons, light but not heavy ones. And so they're old but not modern. Like there are always these red lines that the government kind of drew itself and then decided to get over it. And maybe we're going to see a similar step soon, maybe at the Ramstein meeting on Friday. I don't know.
The Ramstein meeting on Friday being the one where the U.S. Defense Secretary will be.
Well, the Ukraine contact group, basically, the supporters of Ukraine are meeting in Ramstein, and that could be a moment to announce a European plan to send Leopards, which again would require at the very least kind of the German okay, even if it weren't to send tanks itself, although I think it would need to in order to get the 100 or 100 plus tanks together. But and public opinion is indeed divided on this, and also is changing, by the way. The more we see atrocities like the one we just discussed at the beginning of this show, the more the Germans are also in favor of supporting Ukraine even more militarily.
Yeah, because we're talking about how this works militarily. Frank Ledwidge, maybe we just need to take one moment to talk about why. We lost the connection with Oxford. We'll try to reconnect. I'll put it to you, Ulrike. The question of why this is happening, because you heard Jakob saying how there is the Ukrainians fighting a conventional war on behalf of its NATO allies. But with this pledge of tanks, is this more and more that narrative that Vladimir Putin was talking about on the eve of his February 24th invasion, that this is a battle between Russia and the West?
No, I would absolutely not say this. So the Ukrainians are first and foremost defending themselves. The Ukrainians have been attacked illegally. They have been occupied. Parts of the country have been occupied. The people living in this territory are being tortured. So they are first and foremost defending themselves, and this is their right. The United Nations Charter says that they have the right to do this. Now, indirectly, they are also defending European security and the European security architecture. And the reason why we're saying this is because if Russia were to get away with this, if a stronger country, a country with a nuclear weapon, could just go and invade its neighbors and occupy territory, that would destroy the international system as we know it. And so this is why it is said that Ukraine is defending the European security as well. But this isn't a war between Russia and NATO, between Russia and the West. Yes, the West is supporting Ukraine because it has the right to self-defense, and quite honestly, not supporting it would basically mean letting them die. But I would never say that this is the West fighting Russia. This is very much a Putin narrative and not what we're seeing at the moment, especially since we're just discussing that, there are lots of things that the West doesn't want to deliver, and they have been very, very cautious not to escalate.
All right. At the heart of it, again, is what was referred to earlier by Bernard de Montferrand, which is catching a continent off guard about the obsolescence of some of its defense systems. Germany did an about-face when the chancellor pledged $100 billion to revamp the army at the start of Putin's invasion last February. But Olaf Scholz, defense minister, well, she didn't do the job. Retreat headlined Bavarian regional daily Augsburger Allgemeine on Monday as a beleaguered Christine Lambrecht, pictured here in a tank, prepared to tender her resignation. Michael Maitland-Jones has more.
It was through a brief message on her Facebook page that German Defence Minister Christine Lambrecht made her announcement. After a series of perceived blunders, she will be resigning.
Months of media focus on me doesn't allow for fact-based reporting and discussion about soldiers, the army and security policy in the interest of German citizens.
On a visit to a defence electronics supplier on Monday, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz took the opportunity to thank her for her work.
After Russia's terrible war of aggression on Ukraine, the Minister of Defense has shown tremendous commitment to ensuring that we leave the beaten track of decades behind and make the big breakthrough that is important for our national defense, but also specifically for supporting Ukraine.
Despite praise from the Chancellor, Christine Lambrecht's time in office has not been without problems. In February, her department drew mockery for sending 5,000 military helmets to Ukraine, while Kyiv was requesting heavy weapons. It also emerged she had flown in a military helicopter with her son on holiday. Her new year got off to a rocky start when a video she posted, speaking of positive meetings she'd had during the war in Ukraine, as the sound of fireworks exploded around her, was criticised as tone-deaf.
2022, what a year it has been. It created incredible challenges for us. War is raging in the heart of Europe. I was able to gain many insights and meet many interesting and wonderful people. For this, I wish to express my heartfelt thanks.
Her resignation comes as Germany is facing calls to send Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. Similar deliveries have been pledged by the US, UK and Poland. A NATO meeting hosted by the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is scheduled for Friday at Germany's Ramstein air base. New military aid for Ukraine is expected to be announced.
Bernard de Montferrand, the fall of Christine Lambrecht, what's the moral of that tale?
I think, first of all, it's not a general problem. It's a personal, the problem of a person. I think this was a mistake in casting. She was not the right person for this job. What does it mean more generally? I think it means, if you compare action with the actions of our predecessors, that whether you are in NATO or not, the strengths of your armed forces are your own responsibility. You have to work so that your fighter jets, your helicopters, your tanks are ready to fight. And in Germany, it has been very difficult, and we understand why, because there is a history, there is a new culture in this field, and there is also a division between the different parties which are a member of the coalition. So it's a difficult problem to tackle, and a big, the Chancellor has spoken is Zeitwende. It is,
which means the about face, right?
A change of time, right. And this change of time is particularly difficult for Germany, because to engage German soldiers in a fight, the Bundestag has to intervene in a very precise way. So it's difficult. I think Germany will do it. But today, Mrs. von der Leyen had published, when she was minister, some figures about the readiness of the different elements of the armed forces in Germany. It was surprisingly bad. We also, in France, have some areas in which we are not completely ready, but the situation in Germany was not good. So it is, I think, a signal that Germany must take its responsibility in matters of defense more seriously in the public opinion, and the public opinion is still extremely prudent in this area, and that Germany has to change its attitude. For instance, as exports for arms, we French always problem with Germans when we were manufacturing common equipment.
And by the way, there is a plan to manufacture a common tank.
Yes, and it's difficult because, for instance, the rules of export have to be discussed. And when you have to help somebody outside, and when you sell an equipment, if you sell, I need the authorization of the Germans to give you new munitions or things like that, it's not a good argument to sell those equipment.
Frank Ledwidge, is this a Germany problem, or is it a NATO problem? I mean, again, you have different countries that have different specs for making this equipment, but also for authorizing it.
Well, yes, and there is a strategic perspective to this. Let's not forget, for the last 20 years, or much of the last 20 years, we've been engaged in irrelevant adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places, which have essentially been displacement activities. And the result has been that countries like the UK, their armed forces are, as Bernard hints, including France, a shadow of what they were and a shadow of what they need to be. There's one country in Europe which is taking its major country, I should say, in NATO, which is taking its defence seriously, and that's Poland. It's becoming will become quite a power in the near future. And as Bernard already said, this is a national problem, not a regional or NATO problem. This is a question for each country. Just to put things in perspective, Britain has 149 tanks in its army now. We just sent yesterday 30, or will be sending 30 self-propelled guns. Our whole fleet now is 70 self-propelled guns. It's 12% of the artillery we had in 1989, in a context of a war now in Ukraine, which is essentially an artillery war. It's little short of shocking. Countries like Britain, to a lesser extent France, have been strategically at sea now for much of the last 2 decades, and now we're seeing the result.
Jakob Hessler?
Yeah, I think if you take the longer view on the German defense ministers, I think the last one who really became a success was Helmut Schmidt, who became chancellor. Since then,
You're going back to the 1970s here.
So since then, it's been a rather ungrateful job. Look, the Mrs. Merkel designated successor, that was her step, it was supposed to be the stepping stone. It didn't work out. Ursula von der Leyen could escape to Brussels. Can't exactly say that her tenure was full of success. Rudolf Scharping, a SPD politician, was rather being in the pool in Mallorca.
Okay, but that was then, yeah. This is now.
But I think the issue is, it tells you how difficult it is to get this change going. It's a very big bureaucracy. Apart from highly specialized missions of KFOR in Afghanistan, in Kunduz, in some of the regions, there has been the French army has fought in Africa, has had theater experience. I think in Germany, to change the complete mindset, and it's not just money. I think Eva Högel, who is the in charge of reporting on military matters in the parliament side, actually yesterday or 2 days ago came out and said it's probably not 100 billion they need, but 300 billion, because you need to. It's not just buying new weapons; is you need to re-engineer the whole systems operability, interoperability of systems, and that's just costs money and time. It's not just, you can just not like go to a toy store and then you equip yourself like a RoboCop and then next day you go to war. And that's why it's such a formidable challenge for Germany, I think.
And yet, there are a lot of countries relying on Germany. We were talking about the New Year's Eve greeting of the defense minister. Speaking of New Year's greetings, Ukraine's president took to Twitter December 31st to address the German people in their own language. And once again, he used, and you picked up on this, Ulrike Franke, he said, Danke für die Zeitenwende. Thank you for the, how would you translate Zeitenwende?
Yeah, turn off the time, I guess. Yeah, and it is interesting indeed that Zelensky wrote this tweet, and particularly interesting because it continues. He says, "Thank you for the Zeitenwende," but then also, let's hope. I'm paraphrasing. Let's hope that we can make it a success in 2023, which of course kind of refers to the fact that the Zeitenwende, understood as a number of policy changes in Germany, hasn't been achieved yet. Right? It was announced on the 27th of February, so 3 days after the initial invasion. Or the invasion in 2022 by Russia in Ukraine. But a lot of the things that had been announced by the Chancellor Scholz haven't really been done yet. I mean, we were talking about the 100 billion, a special fund that was decided upon. So this was announced in February, and it was in December that the first real money was spent out of this fund. So this is very much kind of peacetime speed, and so the times haven't really turned yet, I'd say, in Germany, although there has been a bit of a change in tone and rhetoric and things that we're doing.
And to go all in, you heard there Jakob Hessler talking about a mindset within the civil service in Germany. Is that changing? I mean, there's war not too far from Germany's borders now.
Yeah, so this is kind of the big cultural question, the strategic culture role question. And so I would agree that Germans over the last decades, I mean, definitely since the end of the Cold War, but probably already before, so ever since the end of the Second World War, really became quite comfortable in an approach that rejected all things military. There was kind of this belief that, well, the world has moved on. We Germans in particular have understood that war is never the answer, military solutions are never the answer. And so we kind of have become enlightened. And so we now have moved on to a system where international law is more important, where trade is more important. And so hard power doesn't matter quite as much anymore. And I think we're now slowly realizing that, well, we were probably wrong on this. And just because we feel like we have been enlightened and have realized that war isn't the answer anymore, that doesn't mean that the others, I mean, as in our opponents, people like Vladimir Putin, are thinking the same thing. And so I think there is indeed a bit of a change in the mindset happening, but this takes time. This isn't something that just happens from one day to the other. And indeed, this is just the mindset, if you like. Then in order to really move forward, you have to change and reform the MOD, the Bundeswehr, the system in and of itself, which indeed a lot of ministers have tried to reform over the last decades and usually got stuck for a variety of reasons. Now is the moment. And by the way, I think this was one of the main problems I had with Christine Lambrecht as defense minister, that she didn't seem particularly keen on driving a big reform forward. Because if there ever was a moment to do this, it's now with the Zeitenwende, and she just didn't seem to want to do this. And I hope the next defense minister will try to really turn things around.
Is part of the problem, Jakob Hessler, also a problem of her political party, the Social Democrats, which has gone in for a lot of criticism, particularly as the former chancellor, Gerhard Schroeder, now works for the Russians at Gazprom, and this idea of a reluctance that's particular to the SPD?
I wouldn't. Well, while I would say that probably you find a lot of doubters within the SPD itself has a plurality of voices. It's a big chapel, and you have, I think, you have enough. It's not an excuse, let's put it that way. Olaf Scholz doesn't think that way, and there are enough people in the SPD who would be capable and willing to drive this.
Why is he still in the party?
Who?
Schröder.
Schröder. Because the SPD as a party has decided that it has membership rules and that he seems to not have violated any of the rules of membership.
When you think back, Bernard de Montferrand, 15 years to the time when you were ambassador in Berlin, would you think that in 2023, the SPD would be seen as the dovish party in a coalition and the Greens would be seen as the hawkish party in the coalition?
No, because I remember you that one party which took a very strong position in favor of foreign commitments and engagements is the party of Joschka Fischer during the Yugoslavian crisis. So this has come from rather far. It has been also a slow movement, but what we knew at that time was that the level of dependence of Germany in matters of energy vis-à-vis Russia was a real problem. In the late 2008, 9, 10, there were many discussions, and we were saying the Germans, of course, we know that the Russians have always respected the contracts, but nevertheless, it's dangerous to have more than a certain level of dependence.
And what did they tell you in conversations, the Germans, at the time?
The answer was always, we know the Russians, we have known them for a very long time, we know the Russian mentality, and we know the respect that the Russians always respect the contracts in matters of energy. The reality was different.
But you know that when the first was built was under President Reagan, and at the time President Reagan was opposed to the building of a pipeline to deliver gas from Russia to Germany. But in fact, the lobbying of energy companies and industry, including Americans, was so strong that finally he just said, well, then go with it. And when you read the argument he had in 82 or 3, it reads, you can just change the date. It reads, it's the exact same argument 20 years or 30 years or 40 years later.
Ulrike Franke, we speculate on that history not being particularly kind to Gerhard Schröder. Of course, his successor, Angela Merkel, the Gazprom, the Nord Stream's pipelines, they come out in Germany in her home constituency. So she had such an aura about her when she left office. Is history going to be unkind to her?
Oh, that is a very interesting question. Yeah, so it's been quite interesting to see that she really hasn't made many public announcements ever since stepping down. She gave a few kind of select interviews in which she basically said that she would do the same thing again, or rather that her decisions on all things Russia, let's say, were right at the time. And I think a lot of people kind of disagree with this now. I find it difficult to judge, what history is going to say. No, I think, there are certain dependencies that she built up, or at least didn't work against, that we now realize weren't a good idea. But it is also, she does have a point saying that, the times were different then, which means that it would have had big difficulties on driving through other policies had she wanted. I'm not saying that she did, but had she wanted, given public opinion and given the parties in general a view of Russia, German industry, maybe. So I think it would have been difficult to do other policies, but she didn't seem to try, to be quite honest.
Frank Ledwidge, we've been talking about Germany a lot in this discussion, right? Appropriately so, since because of the Leopard tanks and all. You could replace the word Germany by Japan. They're facing similar issues when it comes to militarizing their defense system and overhauling it. And do you wonder, as a former military man, why it is we live in a time when the likes of Germany and Japan have to overhaul their military?
I think Japan's having something of an extended shock with respect to China's approach to Taiwan. It's very interesting, of course, that Japan has, in everything but explicitly, indicated that it would step forward to the defense of Taiwan were it to be attacked. But I also have to say that Japan's self-defense forces are in way better shape than any European country. I mean, if you look at their navy, their air force, their army, they are streets ahead of everyone. Just like to mention something about Germany, though, which is quite interesting, rather ironic, really, in view of the sort of cultural aversion to the use of main force, that the 100 billion euros announced last year was the largest single investment was for a squadron of more than a squadron of F-35s, yeah. American F-35s, the purpose of which is, the avowed and essentially sole purpose of which is to deliver nuclear weapons on behalf of NATO. And again, I would stress, and I think both Jakub and Ulrike have mentioned this, that $100 billion wouldn't even get you to the starting line. $200 or $300 billion for Germany is the kind of figure we need to think about to recover the 20 or 30 years of misinvestment or disinvestment in their armed forces.
And when you look ahead to that Friday meeting that's going to include the U.S. Defense Secretary, we've been talking a lot when it comes to the EU of pooling resources, of more federalism. Is this that kind of watershed moment for NATO when it comes to things like the modernization of equipment that you just described, where decisions might have to be taken at the supranational level?
Well, yes, I can't really speak to the intra-NATO discussions, but with respect to support for Ukraine, it's worth mentioning that the Ukrainians haven't asked for 100 tanks. They've asked for 300 tanks, 500 infantry fighting vehicles, like the Marders or Bradleys, and 700 new pieces of artillery. And what we've had up to now, dozens of those, rather than the hundreds required. So in terms of step changes, it may well be that the Ramstein meeting on Friday may represent something of a sea change, but I don't think it's going to get to the level that the Ukrainians have requested. And I certainly don't think there'll be a policy shift in NATO more widely. I don't see any sign of that at all. In fact, I see signs of restraints on defence budgets. Certainly in the UK, I can say that for sure.
Bernard de Montferrand?
No, just one point. You said to take decisions at supranational levels in defence. I think in defense it doesn't work. All the decisions are national. If the Germans decide to deliver Leopard tanks, it is their decision. It is not the decision of NATO. So this has consequences on the way NATO is organized. I remind a very simple thing that the forces of NATO are not forces of NATO. They are national forces affected to the common defense. And when we have an operation within the NATO framework, you always have a direct link between the nation which gives its forces to NATO and the commander on the field, because the French president, the American president, or the German chancellor will never allow its own forces to be used or to be utilized in a way that it doesn't agree. And today, as your very immediate communication, this national links remain extremely strong. And I think if we look in the future, it is very important not to forget this point.
All right, so the nations still matter when it comes to matters of defense. Bernard de Montferrand, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank as well Jakub Hessler. I want to thank Frank Ledwidge for being with us from Oxford. Ulrike Franke in Berlin, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.